Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I am Bob Rose, and I am the president of the Jewish Historical Society of New Jersey, and I welcome all of you. We have a big crowd today. It's pleasing to me and my wife to get away from the house, just to get away from all the town hall meetings and so on and so forth, and I think that for everybody it'll be a very good diversion. We're going to talk a little bit about the history of our community in the past, a very interesting history. But before we go a little bit further, there's two things. One, everybody has these things, and I was at a program once and I got a telephone call and I'm doing a program and I said, oh, hello, and we had a very nice discussion up on the mic. So don't embarrass yourselves, just, if you would, just mute it so we don't hear it. We're going to be video taping the program, so we don't want any interruptions, so please turn them off. And then the second order of business before we start, we have an important mission in this community. We collect our community's history, and it is a very rich history, and this is a part of that history. And it's all about Jewish identity, Jewish continuity, and we bring that history to life through public programming like this, through our exhibitions, through our publications. And by the way, I embarrassed Linda, but that's okay. Linda, for the last, 5 years, has been working on a book about Louis Bamberger. We all know BAM's downtown Newark, right? BAM's. We all grew up with BAM's. Well, there was never any kind of a definitive biography written about Louis Bamberger and what he meant to the department store industry and the financier that he was and the philanthropist that he was. He did so much in the city of Newark, including the Newark Museum, for example, and so many other things. Well, the book has been accepted for publication by the Brandeis University Press. Yeah. And it's going to be published in the fall. And we're going to do a whole lot of things here on the campus next fall, Linda. And I'm sure you'll all want to buy a book, right? Okay. And the other thing, to do the kind of things that we're doing tonight, it takes funding. And we get some support from upstairs, but not a whole heck of a lot. So we really depend on all of you. In an ideal world, all of you sitting out there would be members of our society. We need your membership, we need your support. I feel like Channel 13. Please, we need your support. And so sitting out there, besides the little pushki box, which we're happy for donations, are applications for membership. And what I would really love each of you to do, if you're not a member, on your way out, kindly pick one up, take it home with you, take a look at it, and join us. It's a wonderful thing I think we're doing for the community. We're preserving that history, and we're bringing it to life before all of you tonight. So it's going to be a wonderful program. And now it's my great pleasure to introduce the introducer, a former president who probably knows more about Jewish history in Newark, history of Newark, a distinguished author. Nazis in Newark was really one of the great pieces of research that Warren Grover, our former president here, put together after a number of years of very serious research. It's still available, isn't it, Warren?
Yes.
Hardcover or softcover?
I think
Only softcover. So here it is. Warren knows just a tremendous amount of the history, both good and bad, including some of you, I'm sure, attended a few years back a lecture that drew a crowd like this on Maugie's Woman, but also very familiar with Myron Sugerman's background. So, without further ado, I'm going to ask Warren to come up here and formally introduce our speaker for this evening. Thank you.
Good evening. members and friends of the Jewish Historical Society of New Jersey. When I was at Peshine Avenue School in Newark, we were assigned pen pals. Pen pals during World War II, soldiers, and then after the war, people, returning veterans, and people who were just getting a start. In my classes, everybody was assigned a pen pal except me. I don't know why, but I wasn't assigned a pen pal. So for 50 some odd years, I've always had that regret. Fortunately, I met 20 years ago my first pen pal. He was a guest at the time, 20 years ago. He was a guest of the United States government, a recipient of free room and board. His name is Myron Sugerman. I had heard that Myron was an expert on the history of Longies-Wilman and his Third Ward gang. I was in the middle of interviewing surviving gang members, and I was going to use all those interviews for my book. I was put in touch with Myron and soon discovered what a font of information he is. In his correspondence to me, he gave me so much information on those that we could talk about. There were some that were sort of active, so he couldn't talk too much because the phone was not too safe. Myron gained his experience, gained his acquaintances because of his father, known to his friends as Shuggy. Shuggy was one of Longie's associates. He knew almost everybody that was in Longies-Wilman's gang. It was called the Third Ward Gang at the time. And because Shuggy and Myron were in the same business, slot machines and vending machines, they got very close, and soon, very soon, Shuggy imparted to Myron all the stories from the 1930s. So many stories, some good, some bad. When Shuggy passed away, Myron took the reins of the business. And since he did that, he met his father's associates who had been with Longie. He was very friendly with some of them and some not so friendly. When Myron returned from his paid vacation, he was able to accompany me to all of Longie's Third Ward gang members that were still around and still alive. I couldn't meet many of them. They wouldn't accept a call from a stranger. But when Myron called them and said he's bringing a friend over, they all said yes. These men, these interviews were 20 years ago. All of these men have passed to the great beyond. The only thing that survives many of them are the interviews I did and Myron did with them so many years ago. And just so you know, the Jewish Historical Society has a tape of every one of those interviews. So if you want to hear some real characters, some not such good characters, go to the Jewish Historical Society and see Jill Hirschhorn. Myron and I have remained friends over the last 20 years, sharing meals and Newark stories. No one knows as much about Longy and his associates as Myron Sugerman. His memoir, not yet published, but something I'm sure that'll see the light of day within 20 years, let's hope. It's a treasure trove of information, most of it unknown to any of us. I now present you the real deal Myron Sugerman.
We got more people here tonight than Kol Nidra. You tell gangster stories and everybody wants to hear about gangsters, mobsters, and so forth. Well, I'm glad to share all these stories with you tonight. But before I start, I got to put a plug in for the Historic Society because Linda asked me to put in a plug in for tonight. We're running out of horses' heads. Tonight's story is the story of the history of the Jewish mob and the contributions of the Jewish mob for the betterment of the welfare of the Jewish people, both here in the United States and in pre-state Israel. I want you to keep in mind, as I give this speech, a certain thought. And the thought is like this. If the Jewish gangster in the United States had been born in Palestine, pre-state Israel, he would have been a Jewish patriot. And had the Jewish patriot of Palestine been born in the United States, he would have been a Jewish gangster. And why do I say that? As you're going to hear me tell the story tonight, you'll see that there's a connection, a mindset, a mentality, a connection between the Jews of the United States, the wise guys, the hoodlums, the gangsters, the outlaws, and our patriots who were members of the three different underground militaries, Irgun, Lehi, and Haganah. So with that in mind, let me start and tell the story. All right, first of all, people always ask, what was the beginning of the Jewish mob? Well, you had, of course, in each neighborhood, in each city of the United States of America, you had the ghettos. And in the ghettos, you had tough kids that emerged as a result of poverty. Most went on to do legitimate, but there were those that chose illegitimate. And in particular, when the Act of Prohibition was passed, this was a stimulus for really the development of organized crime. But proceeding a little further, I want to ask people here if anybody's ever heard the names of Salvatore Maranzano and the name of Giuseppe Masseria. Does anybody know those names? Michael, you know it? You're full of shit. The Maranzano and Masseria were the original Italian mafia. And they were what was called the old mustaches. They would only do business with Italians. They wouldn't do business with any other ethnic group. They were the original two combatants in what was known as the Castellamarese Wars, from Castellamarese from Sicily. that brought over from Sicily this mentality? Well, the Young Turks defied the powers ultimately of the old mustaches, and they, particularly led by Charlie Lucky Luciano, had a revolt of the Young Turks. Now, in the case of Maranzano, he was killed by Albert Anastasia and other Italians. He was assassinated. But in the case of Joe Masseria, Joe the Boss, Lucky Luciano went to Meyer Lansky and said to him to bring his crew to kill Masseria, because Masseria wouldn't recognize the Jews. So he brought with him Bugsy Siegel, Bo Weinberg, and Sam Red Levine. Now, interesting about Sam Red Levine is that he was an Orthodox Jew, Shomer Shabbat, wore kippah, and would never kill anybody on Shabbat unless he absolutely had to. So with the assassination of Maranzano and Masseria, Lucky Luciano emerged as the leader of the modern mob. Now, the Jews had their own mob, and the names are very common and known by everybody here. Meyer Lansky, of course, and Benny Siegel. Don't call him Bugsy, please. They don't like that name. Doc Stacher. And I'd like everybody to know that tonight we are honored to have the nephew of Doc Stacher sitting here. Michael, stand up so that everybody can give you an ovation. Come on, get up. All right? And the stories that I know about Doc Stacher, I know personally firsthand, but I know many from Michael because Michael tells great stories as far as his uncle is concerned. Then you had, of course, Mickey Cohn, you had Lepke, Buchalter, you had all different, in all neighborhoods and all cities, we had our own Jewish mob. But the Jewish mob basically worked in conjunction under the auspices of Meyer Lansky. Meyer Lansky was really the boss of the Jews in general, but on an equal level was Abner Longies Willman. And of course, Abner Longies Willman was Newark, New Jersey, and he was a little bit under the radar insofar as the as far as the public was concerned. It became later known, but in terms of actual power, he was on an equal level as was Doc Stacher. Now, Doc Stacher was also in Newark, New Jersey. Longy was Newark, New Jersey. And they were the bosses, and they were the ones that got together with Reinfeldt during the time of Prohibition, and they emerged as the Newark Third Ward Gang. So the godfather or the mentor of Meyer Lansky and all the others was a fellow by the name of Arnold Rothstein. Arnold Rothstein was not of the poverty, it was not of the ghetto, he was of a middle-class family, and but he just had criminal instincts. And he liked the criminal life, and he was actually the teacher to Lansky and to the boys from the ghetto. He taught them manners, he taught them the better things as far as life was concerned. And of course, they coveted that good life, and they followed Rothstein. Rothstein was a gambler, ultimately got shot in front of Lindy's in New York, and when they asked who was it that shot you, and he refused to say, and he died with the name of his perpetrator, they took it to his grave. As far as the Jewish mob was concerned, so the question now becomes, where did they make these contributions? Well, first of all, the contribution begins when they're kids. They're in the Third Ward, they're in Prince Street, and in those days, in the early times, anti-Semitism was rampant, and everybody took the best shot as far as the Jews were concerned. You had other ethnics, particularly Irish, Polish, Italians, would come over into the Jewish neighborhoods and work on the peddlers and the push carts. So you had to protect your neighborhood. You had to protect your mother. You had to protect your father. You had to protect your family. So the peddlers used to say, as soon as there was an attack coming from the other ethnic neighborhoods, so they used to say in Yiddish, "Rift for the langer," call the langer, the long one, the big one, tall one. Longy was 6'2", which he was considered a tall man, so he got the name Longy as a result of the Yiddish word langer. And he was already showing early signs of leadership. So they protected the neighborhood, they protected the ghetto, just as the same way as it was in New York and Minneapolis and Chicago, Boston, Philadelphia. Every city had its protection. Now, some with a jaundiced view would say, oh, they charge protection in the neighborhoods. I'm sure that also went on, and it did go on. But basically, insofar as those that emerged as leaders had certain principles that they didn't violate. They really protected their neighborhoods. The second element, or the second phase of the historical contribution of the mob was, of course, and Bob Rose talked about it, this very famous history written by Warren Grover called The Nazis in Newark, and I recommend everybody get this book and read a great piece of Newark history. In this particular time, the Fritz Kuhn was the head of the American Nazi Party, independent from Hitler, Yamach Shemo, but still he formed what was known as the American Nazi Party for the purpose of provoking and disseminating Nazi National Socialist philosophy and politics and so forth within the large German community that we had here in Newark and in the suburbs. So in the time that the American Nazi Party would meet and have their Bund meetings, so it was brought to Longy's attention early on. Faye Mohawk told me, Faye Mohawk Skuratowski, where's Elliot, where are you? Okay, there's the Skuratowski family over there. Yes, and your mother, God bless her, Sam's daughter. So Faye told me, may she rest in peace, that Longy's mother used to daven in a shul on Lyons Avenue, and across the street from that shul was a Nazi meeting hall. And they would start to abuse the old Jews. So immediately, Longy, under his leadership, contacted a former prize fighter by the name of Nat Abramowitz, who was known as Nat Arno. He fought under the name of Nat Arno. Incidentally, for a piece of history, we had great prize fighters that came out of Newark, New Jersey, none of which ever reached championship, but we had many, many prize fighters, including Ali Stoltz, who did fight 2 times for the lightweight championship of the world. Let me tell you a story about Jaime Kugel. Jaime Kugel was a referee. And in those days, Jaime would referee the fights in Newark. He was a dear friend of my father's, Alav Shalom. And Jaime loved Jews. So one night, he's refereeing a fight, and there's a guy by the name of Greenberg, and he gets knocked on his ass. So Jaime, he starts to go like this. Now you have to understand, in those days, many guys, many fellas took other names to disguise so that the parents, to conceal from their parents, they were prize fighting. So with Greenberg, Jaime starts to give the count like this. 1, 2, 3. He says, you dumb Jew, get the hell up. Guy looks up and he says, I'm not Jewish, I'm Italian. 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, you're out. We had 26,000 professional Jewish prize fighters in history. 26,000 boys from the ghettos that used their fists. Now the same, we had 26 Jewish champions from the years up until the late 30s. 26 Jewish prize fighters that ended up being champions. Now, those same prize fighters joined up with Nat Arno and with Longhi's guys to fight the Nazis and the Bundes that were meeting in the German halls in the beer gardens up Springfield Avenue in Irvington, Union, and so forth. So Longhi, of course, had the political connection. He had every judge, he had every cop. By the way, there was somebody that I like to mention because he's never mentioned, but his name was David Quincy Lieberman. I don't think anybody, you remember him, Mikey?
I did.
Huh? You remember Quincy? Yeah, Sandy remembers. He quietly was the connection guy at City Hall in Newark. So Longhi used Quincy. Quincy was a partner with my father in a saloon in Newark, couple of saloons, and very well connected, knew every cop, he knew every politician, he knew every curva, for God's sakes. Why are you looking at me and asking me what it means? The kid knows. How old is this kid, Lou? Huh? Yeah. 17. Yeah, exactly. I'll tell him afterwards. So, when the Bundes had their meetings, Longhi was well informed. Nat Arno called his group the Minutemen in honor of the same Minutemen that fought in the Revolutionary War. They were all called, and everybody went to battle, and they would do a job on these Nazis. I hate to say this again. You got a lot of rabbis, you got a Rebbitzin that showed up. But they kicked the shit out of these Nazis. And they did a fantastic job, and this went on for quite a while, in the 30s, nonstop, and also at the same time they had support from the socialists. But in particular, the Jews, under the leadership of Longhi and Nat Arno, they were very, very effective. Meyer Lansky was also asked by Judge Perlman and Rabbi Stephen Wise if he would do the same thing with his leadership in Yorkville, in the German community of Upper Manhattan, and to stop these Bundes from meeting. At one time, there was 25,000 American Nazis, members of the American Nazi Party, that met in Madison Square Garden. It became a rage. It became a plague. Meyer Lansky led a group in Yorkville, which was the German community in Upper Manhattan, and they were also very effective. You also had the same response in Minneapolis and so forth. Wherever there were Bundes and wherever the American, we got to have to remember that the anti-Semitism was rampant in those times. So our guys went in and they did battle, and they did pride, and everybody was proud of them, either quietly, outwardly or quietly. You know, this, well, of course, the organization says, you know, this is a shunda, it's a shunda, it's a shame, you know, and so forth. And on the other hand, the masses loved it because we were now fighting. This was resistance against the Nazis. And just think in terms, if we had the Minutemen, if we had the Third Ward Gang in Munich in 1930, when that son of a bitch was sitting in the Osteria Italiana with his group preparing for World War II and the Holocaust. What if we had mobs? What if we had gangsters in Munich at that time that would have gone in on those mamzerim and kicked the crap out of them? History would have been a little bit different. Now, I just tell you about the second phase of the contribution, and that was a tremendous contribution. And again, I encourage everybody to buy the book, Nazis in Newark, and to read it. It's great history. Warren did a fantastic job. When he wrote me, at that time, when he called me his pen pal, well, that's exactly where I was. A two-year vacation. I did take him to see all the old-timers, and the old-timers cooperated with them, cooperated in terms of telling him exactly. He had it all recorded. It's all valid testimony and so forth. In the there was a very interesting experience, an interesting episode in World War II. In World War II, Charlie Lucky Luciano had been prosecuted for prostitution, an absolute trumped-up charge. His name was thrown thrown around in terms of him taking protection money on the prostitution rackets in New York. At the time, the district attorney was Thomas Dewey, and Lucky Luciano went to trial, lost the trial, and ended up doing got a 30 to 50 year sentence. So at the time, there was a ship that was sunk in the New York harbor. It was called the SS Normandy. The United States Department of Navy reached out for Moses Polikoff. Moses Polikoff was lawyer to both Lucky Luciano and to Myron. He was Admiral Heffernan. He was with the United States Department of Navy and asked Myron if he could ask his help. And what was the help needed? They needed help on the piers as far as any sabotage was concerned. The stevedores, the majority of your longshoremen at that time, were either Italian or Irish. There was a fear as far as the Italians are concerned. Some of them might harbor fascist sentiments, but their loyalty ultimately was to Lucky Luciano. So Myron at that time went to see Lucky Luciano and told him, as patriots, we must cooperate with the United States in the war effort. So Lucky Luciano sent the word to Albert Anastasia, who was the head of Murder Incorporated, who co-chairman of Murder Incorporated, together with Louis Lepke Buchalter, and told them that we needed to cooperate and have every longshoreman cooperate in terms of not of any acts of sabotage, and so forth and so forth. Ultimately, whether it was effective or not, the United States Navy did go to Myron Lansky. Myron Lansky did go to Lucky Luciano. Lucky Luciano did send the word back, and in the process, ultimately, Dewey agreed as the governor, now governor of the state of New York, no longer the prosecutor. He agreed to release Lucky Luciano on the condition that Lucky Luciano would return to Naples or return to Italy. Lucky Luciano returned to Naples, and I'm going to tell a story. He had bodyguards when he was in Naples. In 1965, my father's partner was Jerry Cattina. He gave me a slip of paper one day, and he says to me, go up to Fort Lee, New Jersey. There's a little Italian restaurant up there. Just walk in there, that's all. Don't ask any questions. I walked into the place, and I met with Tommy Ryan Eberly, who was co-chairman of their fraternal order. There were 3 kids there at the time from Naples. Mario Colamarino, Pasquale Gallo, and the third one was Emilio Palomara. And Mario Colamarino and Pasquale Gallo were the private bodyguards to Lucky Luciano when he was living in Naples. I became very, very good friends with Mario. Unfortunately, Emilio Palomara disappeared the following year, and they were still looking for him. So Lucky Luciano ultimately tried to come back to the United States through Cuba, but he was prevented from coming in. And ultimately died, but was granted permission to have his body buried here in New York. Meyer Lansky quietly was he had the power, he had the authority. I met him in 1970 when he was a fugitive from the United States. Not a fugitive. Yes, a fugitive. He had been indicted, knew that he was going to be indicted. There was information, and he took off for Israel. And under the law of return, he expected that the Israeli government would grant him citizenship, allow him to stay there. Now, just one second, people. You talking when I'm talking? Get the hell out of here. See, distract me, goddamn you. What was I talking about now? Lansky. So, in any event, Lansky, I met him. Doc Stature had been accepted made a deal with Robert Kennedy on a park bench in Washington to accept exile from the United States. So he was living in Israel and staying at the, he was like a real, he became like a pioneer, like a real chalutz. He was living in the honeymoon suite at the Sheraton Hotel. And every time I used to go to Israel, I would call Doc and tell him, Doc, ich bin du. Okay, come see me. He put handcuffs on me. I had to be with him every day, every night, for the entire time that I was in Israel. And one day he says to me, Etz Chaim, die darf sein du Shabbos. You listen to me, you be here Shabbos. I said, oh my God, Doc, he's got a sudden renaissance of religiosity. He says, don't be a wise guy, you just be here Saturday. Sure enough, Saturday lunch, in walks Meyer Lansky. And it was very interesting. As a kid, I was scheduled to go to live and to work in a slot machine operation in Lagos, Nigeria the following month. And I meet Meyer Lansky, a nice man, very, very nice man. Gentleman, quiet, complete opposite of Doc. Doc was a balagula. Meyer Lansky, afterwards, and Doc Stature, we finish our lunch, and he said, come on, we're going to the tail end of the lobby so nobody can hear us. And they wanted to know about Mr. Cattina, who had been incarcerated in the United States in New Jersey for refusal to testify to a grand jury 1970. years later, I ran into Mr. Katina in Florida, and I told him the story, and he says, we were very, very good friends. Lansky was a real lover. All these guys were real Jew lovers. They had no identity crisis, and after the war and the beginning of the struggle for independence for the state of Israel, this is the fourth phase of contribution that our guys made, and it was terrific. You had three underground militaries at the time. One was Haganah, which was Ben Gurion. The other one was Etzel, which was Menachem Begin. And the third was a small splinter group from the Irgun called Lehi. And Lehi was Yair Stern. It was known as the Stern Gang, FFI, the Fighters for the Freedom of Israel. And one of the members, or the leading members of that organization, was Yitzhak Shamir, who ultimately became the Prime Minister of the State of Israel. But he was an ardent, strong member of the movement, of that particular movement. The difference between Irgun and Etzel and Lehi, Irgun and Lehi, was Irgun said, we will suspend fighting the British as long as the British fight the Germans and the Nazis. Whereas Stern Gang says, we don't care, we will continue fighting the British while they're fighting the Nazis. They were extreme right in terms of political behavior and political philosophy. Well, in 1948, everybody remembers, knows that Ben Gurion stood up and made the declaration for the establishment of the State of Israel. And 20 minutes after this announcement and declaration, the President Harry S. Truman, a good old anti-Semite from Missouri, but a hell of a man, recognized the State of Israel and went against his complete State Department, against George Marshall, who was his Secretary of State, who was a very well-known general during World War II. But unfortunately, because of pressure from the State Department, ultimately the United States passed what was known as the Neutrality Act. And the Neutrality Act was an act that prohibited the sale of weapons to Palestine, to either the Jews or to the Arabs. So what happened? The patriots of Irgun, Lehi, and Haganah came to the United States and immediately sought out the Chaverim, our boys, my father's friends, and said, we need weapons. And sure enough, all of our guys did everything within their power to get them weapons, including, if it was necessary, stealing them. They bought them because there was a tremendous amount of surplus military equipment from the end of World War II. But the key was how to ship that merchandise, because it had to be manifested differently than you couldn't declare it as weaponry under the Neutrality Act. So, again, Meyer Lansky, Abner Longies-Wilman, they went to Frank Costello and Albert Anastasia and told them, we need your help on the piers. We want all your longshoremen to participate, give us a hand. We're shipping agricultural equipment, but of course it was TNT. We're shipping sewing machines, we're shipping this, we're shipping that. It was all manifested illegally, and without the cooperation of the stevedores, the longshoremen, weaponry couldn't be shipped. Of course, there was the Rudolph Sonnenborn group, which were very wealthy, legitimate businessmen. that were at the forefront and cooperated with our guys in terms of buying up all that surplus equipment from all over the United States, as well as Panama and Nicaragua, where you had dictators like Anastasio Somoza. At the time at Somoza, he got 3.5% on all the purchases of weaponry that were shipped. Only one country supplied armament to the Jews, and that was Czechoslovakia, Thomas Masaryk. But again, in terms of our guys were terrific. That connection at the piers was immeasurable in terms of shipping weaponry to the Jews. There was a compatibility of the mind of the Ergun, the Haganah, and the Lehi with your American gangster. Now, insofar as Palestine was concerned, our boys in Palestine, our patriots, were busy robbing banks, blowing up trains, assassinating Moyne, the highest officer of the British Empire in the Mideast. 2 young kids from Lebanon, 2 Jewish boys, 19 years of age, on bicycles, assassinated Lord Moyne, which incidentally didn't sit well with Winston Churchill. Our boys also ultimately assassinated Folk Bernadette, who was the UN High Commissioner. In addition to which, our boys acted and the Patriots, they did what we had to do. If you had an informer, you killed him. And there was the very famous killing on the beaches of Tel Aviv of Azazalov, Chaim Azazalov. Right, Chaim? So there was a compatibility. It was easy for them to come to us. Teddy Kollek, who was the mayor of Jerusalem, a very well-known, famous mayor of Jerusalem, was very friendly, and friendly with Frank Sinatra. And Frank Sinatra also at the same, was a supporter of the Jewish state, because he just liked Jews, and he was in show business. They were his friends. Although one time he got a little bit out of line in Las Vegas, Nevada, and said to Carl Cohn, got a little bit nasty with Carl Cohn, and Carl Cohn gave Frank Sinatra one shot. Frank Sinatra went down, and Hank Greenspun from the Las Vegas papers wrote the next day headlines, "Frank Sinatra don't screw around with the Jews in the desert." So I think, I'm trying to wrap it up. I think I give you a pretty good picture as far as, I could go on and tell more stories. One other story, yeah. More stories, I could tell you endless stories. There was a rabbi from Hungary by the name of Tibor Rosenbaum. Tibor Rosenbaum was a hero in Hungary as far as helping the Jews was concerned. After the war, he ended up in Switzerland, in Geneva, Switzerland, and he had a bank that was called the Banque du Crédit. That bank was the funneling for undeclared money that was being used to help the Zionist cause. Now, a few years later, there was an employee, had a manager. His name was Sylvan Ferdman, and I met Sylvan Ferdman in Geneva. Sylvan Ferdman was the bagman. There was the connection between the Banque du Crédit and Meyer Lansky in Florida. All the rake-off from the casinos in Las Vegas went to Florida, where the monies were distributed, the accounts were identified, and the money was taken by Sylvan Ferdman, put in a bag, and carried off to Geneva, Switzerland, with the exception of one time when the note fell out of his pocket with the names of the individuals and the account numbers. But Tibor Rosenbaum was a Mossad guy. Ultimately, was Mossad. When we had another fella in Panama, who was a Chicago guy. He was with Al Capone's crew. His name was High Lerner, L-A-R-N-E-R, High Red Lerner. He was very strong in Panama and very tight with Noriega. As a matter of fact, Panama at a certain time when Noriega was in power was really an extension of Jewish power. I think I got more notes. I could tell you more stories. But I want to sort of bring it to an end, and I'm sure that you people have some questions that you want to ask. If I like your questions, I'll answer them. If I don't like your questions, get cocking.
Okay. I have a microphone, and I'm happy to pass the mic to anybody that has a question. You have it over this side. Okay. So if you'd like to ask a question of Myron, just let me know and I'll give you a mic. Okay.
I just wanted to ask you one thing, since you were from Newark and everything. I have a very dear friend who passed away, Dave Howe. Did you know him?
He was a bookmaker in Hillside, New Jersey. We used to go on Friday nights to his house, watch all the fights, and we used to have, we'd make a lottery, which round the guy would get knocked out in. Sure, I knew Dave. He was a very close friend of my father.
I could tell you stories about
You could tell us stories about Dave Tao, yeah. Brookside Swim Club.
He came to me one time looking for a job. He comes in.
Can't hear you.
Stand up, stand up.
Question? No, just a quick story which someone had they have in common. She comes in, and I had an ad in the paper for a car salesman. I had a car wash. This is back in the early 70s. This guy comes in looking for a job. And I'm looking, back in the set, his suit had to be $2,000. Yeah. This guy wants a job.
Did you ask him how much he owed on it?
He worked for me 3 years, never sold the car, but I had the best time with him. And then I told him I was going to Vegas. He says, go to Caesars, ask for Billy Weinberger, you'll own the place.
His wife's name was Helen and the son was Barry.
Right, exactly. Were you ever in his house with all his mementos?
Pardon?
Were you ever in his house with all his mementos?
We lived in his house on Friday nights. Just go to watch all the fights.
The best was the letter from President.
Let somebody else ask questions.
Personally made out to him and Helen.
Do you, from your own knowledge, know whether after Sugerman dealt in drugs and or prostitution in the Newark area?
That's a good question, and I'm glad you asked it. No. The old timers, Meyer Lansky, Longy, that level, no, they didn't deal in what we called the dirty business. Now, that doesn't mean that there weren't others around him, all right, around Meyer, that did deal in drugs. It was so lucrative, it was so tempting that it was impossible. It was so seductive. So there were those that dealt in it. Now, the Italians had a rule that the old school, that if you did deal in it, it was a death sentence. It was a death sentence. But there was so much hypocrisy in it, because whoever brought the biggest envelope was the guy that sat next to the boss, and the boss forgot to ask the source from where that money came from. All right.
A good part of your story was how the mob supported the Jewish community during the time of the Depression with the money they gave out, especially during the holidays. Question I wanted to ask, though, what is your take on the death of Longy Swillman?
Look, I've heard all kinds of stories. When I was a kid and it happened, I was 21. My father, Alav Shalom, told me that it was suicide. There were others that said it wasn't suicide. Johnny Steinbeck, Longy's stepson, insists that it was suicide. It was, it's one of those great mob legends, myths. Who killed him? or did he die by his own hand? The way the circumstances were at the time, that he was depressed, sick, he was sick, ill, and he was depressed, and the government was closing in on him, and it was the collapse of his empire. Longy had sway over the mob. While he was in his heyday, he actually was the most powerful, the most respected. Mr. Katina had equal status. Mr. Katina was the bridge of communication between the Jews and the Italians. There was Longy and the Boot, Richie the Boot Bardo, fought over territory during Prohibition. Ultimately, in 1930, the story is that Al Capone either came himself or sent his brother to make shulam between Longy and between the Boot, and they celebrated at the Victoria Castle restaurant on Park Avenue for 3 days and for 3 nights. And I think that they ended up reasonable friends over the years.
More questions? Let me bring the microphone back to you.
Hello, sir. I have quite a few questions, but
Ask him.
My family name, if you knew my grandfather, Morris Pollock.
Morris Pollock.
He was with the Prince Street crew as a young man, and I believe he was a Minuteman himself.
Okay.
Does that ring a bell?
No.
No, sir?
No. Where's Warren? Warren? Huh? Never, unfortunately. Go ask your other question. Huh?
Hey, Mr. Sugerman. Over here.
Yeah, what is it then? Better ask a sensible question, I'll throw you right the hell out of here.
Okay. What is the status or the story with organized crime in the state of Israel? Jewish organized crime?
Today?
Yes, or is there a history?
Well, when Meyer Lansky was ultimately went to the Supreme Court of Israel, they withdrew his right to stay in Israel, which of course was in violation of the law of return. Under the law of return, every Jew had a right to return and become a citizen of Israel. But at the time, I'll never forget when I was sitting with Mr. Lansky and having lunch on Shabbat, he told me, Myron, he says, when you see your name appear in the newspapers, run for your life. There was tremendous political pressure brought on the Israeli government at that time by the Nixon Mitchell government to return Lansky to the United States to prosecute him. The so-called reason for the withdrawal of his visa was because the Israeli government said he would organize crime in Israel. That's nonsense. That man just wanted to get away from the American government and live his years in peace and quiet. But he was not permitted that privilege. There was tremendous political pressure brought on Golda Meir, and she ultimately, and the decision of the Supreme Court was a political decision and not a judicial decision. Now, as far as organized crime today in Israel, unfortunately, it's there. You have families. These kids that come from North African and Oriental families, 3 brothers, 4 brothers, like the Alperons, like Yeheskel Aslan, like Avi, I can't think of his last name, but he was extradited to the United States. But you have today these gangs, and they are vicious, extremely vicious. And it's a terrible thing because the last thought you would have in your mind is a Jew killing a fellow Jew. It's something beyond our capacity to understand. But today they have their problem with organized crime, and of course they were the Russians that brought in prostitution and drugs. You have drugs, but it's a problem. It's a major problem today, social problem in Israel, because the young people happen to look up to them. You asked a good question. I'm proud of you tonight.
Hi. I wanted some history. Since my Uncle Jake, you mentioned him, Jake Skortovsky, and I know from my brother, who's not here, that he had a club on Hawthorne Avenue. And can you tell us a little bit, you know my Uncle Jake and my father?
Your Uncle Jake was the greatest man on the face of the earth. Your Aunt Faye was, she was a queen. She was just an angel. Now, Jake Mohawk Skorotovsky had a club on Hawthorne Avenue in Newark, and it was a wide open gambling house, and it was all ethnic. You could book a sport bet. You could play a number, and Jake Mohawk was a teacher of mine, and he told me one day. He says, "Listen, kid, you're going to be in the gambling business all your life. Remember one truth." He says, "If you lose your credibility, you have nothing left to lose." He says, "If you're taking a bet, it doesn't make any difference. If they lock you up," he used to send Faye with the list of all the people that she had to go from house to house to make the payoffs. He was just a very special guy, and so was your father.
Who did he report to?
Jake Mohawk was one of the Minutemen, and he was with Longy. And as a matter of fact, during one of the battles with the Nazis, he got hit with friendly fire. He wound up in a hospital, and Longy's Wilman brought in the best doctors to make sure that they would take care of him. And there were mishaberachs made by rabbis all over the United States for his recovery.
I have a question to ask you. What about Bernie Madoff? Did you know him or anything?
That's not a gangster.
I know.
That's not a gangster.
The way you say
That's not a gangster. You want my take on it? You want my take on it? It takes two to tango, all right? He played everybody like a rank sucker, all right? He wouldn't take my money because I had 3 federal cases and 2 state cases, all right? But he would take people from the country club who gave so much money to the UJA, and they were high on the line socially. You had to wait in line in order to give him your money before he lost it for you, all right?
One other question I want to ask you. My aunt, they owned a candy store in Newark, and I heard she was a bookie and all that. Was that part of the mob and everything? Was that true?
Well, if you were a bookmaker, you had to be connected to somebody, all right? You know, there's no such thing as an independent.
You mentioned Hawthorne Avenue. Was there a Jewish organization with an Irish name on Durkin on Hawthorne Avenue?
You're talking about a legitimate organization to me? Sit down.
Hawthorne Avenue, that's where I was brought up, and there was a store there that constantly had traffic.
That's Jake Mohawk's club, next to Lou Tenney's restaurant.
No, it's
Huh?
opposite Leslie Street on Hawthorne Avenue, it's further up.
Further up. See, I don't remember.
Near
sweetheart.
Silver's Bakery?
Yeah.
Yeah. Near the Hawthorne Avenue School? near
Right.
No, but the only action place was Jake Mohawk's club. All right, sweetheart?
Association, I didn't know if they were involved.
Any other questions for Myron? Okay. Well, Mr. Sugerman, we say we bring history to life, and you certainly have brought history to life.
My pleasure.
Thank you so much. As you exit, I hope our push is still there. Please remember to push me and pick up an application, and please join us. We need your support. Thank you.